Good afternoon to all of our ISM chapters, members, and guests joining us today for our program on managing RFPs with our speaker, Tom Cook. Please be sure to ask our speaker for any questions that you have using our chat or the Q&A tab. Now on to our presentation for today. Our speaker is Tom Cook. He is the CEO and Managing Director of Blue Tiger International, a premier international business consulting company on supply chain management, trade compliance, purchasing, global trade, and logistics. Tom was the former CEO of American River International in New York and Apex Global Logistics Supply Chain Operation in Los Angeles. He has over 30 years of experience in assisting companies all over the world, managing their import and export operations. He is a member of the New York District Export Council, sits on the board of numerous corporations, and is considered a leader in the business verticals where he works in. At this point, I'm going to be turning the stage over to Tom and the presentation. Again, please put in any questions that you may have. We'll probably do some in the middle and some towards the end.
Thank you, Kathy, and always appreciate the great job that you do in organizing these events and the work that you do for ISM New Jersey and a bunch of other chapters. And I thank everybody who's attending for your participation. So as you heard, it's Tom Cook, and Blue Tiger International is my company. And basically we're supply chain consultants, and we work in the area mostly involved in global supply chain. And a lot of the work that we do has to do with cost reduction, risk reduction, and creating best practices in procurement and in the supply chain. So the purpose of this event is to share with you a different concept in how to approach managing requests for proposals. So about 19-20 years ago, we were invited in to bid on a PepsiCo procurement opportunity out of their Latin American division based in Miami, Florida. So I went down to visit the head of supply chain as I normally would with an opportunity, and discuss what their actual needs were so that I could make sure that the proposal meets all their deliverables. In that process of dialogue back and forth, one of the questions that I would always ask from the selling side of the business model is to say, do you have a budget for this expense, or do you have any idea of what you were looking to spend in this particular area? And it depends on the procurement person that you're dealing with, whether you're going to get any answers to those questions. But in this particular case, the woman that I was dealing with said to me that what I want you to do in this proposal is to take price out of consideration at the front end. And I want you to provide us with a proposal, not contemplating price, but what would you do to give us the best of all the services and the deliverables that we've spoken about today? How you would deliver them in the best way possible, and how you would offer certain guarantees and service parameters and everything at the highest level, okay? Because we want to make sure in this particular program that we're asking you to do that we get this done the right way. So I said, well, what about the costing? She said, if we end up, selecting you, then we'll negotiate the costing at the end, because we've already benchmarked that costing and we have a pretty good idea of what we should be spending for this expense. So it really surprised me, because I had already been doing this for 10 to 12 years already previously, and I never came across anybody who presented anything like that to us. So we went down that path, and we eventually were rewarded the business. When price came down to finalize the deal, they did share with us the range of pricing that they had came to, and it actually was very close to the range we were anticipating, and so forth. And then the negotiation took place, and we were satisfied with what they ultimately offered, and they were satisfied with the price that they were paying. But the key issue in that example that I'm going to share with you, the intellectual process of how this goes about, really surprised me, and actually working so successfully, because at the end of the day, the customer was totally satisfied with exactly what we were doing, And we were very happy not only to have gotten the opportunity, but also that the remuneration for the work supported the actual effort that was put forth. So that's what I'm going to share with you over the next hour, which is how we go about doing this in a more formal structure. Because we took that basic concept and started to apply it to other circumstances where we're involved with procurement as a consultant, and we now have had a high degree of success in this area. So the idea is to create a successful model for RFPs, ones that are easy to manage at the end of the day, and that really create more sustainable vendor relationships. So our supply chain consulting practice goes back over 30 years, and we work with numerous clients in a lot of different business verticals, buying both products and services, okay? And a lot of times we get brought in to actually help them manage their RFP or handle their RFP. And typically in those cases, it's where there's a huge complexity of the RFP process. It might be a very large spend. They want to make sure that they get value for their spend, or that they anticipate a certain difficulty in the RFP process. So this specific process that I'm going to share with you, and I'm going to share with you 12 steps as we get towards the end of the slide deck, that we established 18 years ago. And it took us about 2 to 3 years to tweak it to where we thought that it was something that we could present into the marketplace. And every year since, we've made improvements on it as we go through the RFP process. It now has been utilized by over 1,500 companies and business executives, with all reporting very favorable results. The methodology at the end of the day is an integral tool in the arsenal of negotiation. It may not be the only tool in the box, and there's other methods of looking at RFPs, but this happens to be one that we have found a high degree of success that I'm going to share with you. At the end of the day, our experience tells us that an RFP is really a negotiating strategy. It's a tool to achieve a new vendor or a supplier, search for better options, or to obtain a better deal. To offer you another way and the process to think through the art and the science of managing the RFP responsibility for the purpose that we're all looking to do, which is to get the best possible results and to obtain tools that can leverage the negotiation process. It can be used for all aspects of sourcing. It can be used for all aspects of purchasing, and it can be used for all aspects of vendor managing and managing your suppliers. The methodology works around the concept of taking price out of the RFP process to the very end of negotiation. The methodology believes that potential vendors and suppliers would prefer to propose offerings where their quality and capability leads the discussion. I sit on both sides of the fence, on the procurement side where I'm buying, but I also sit on the sales side where I'm selling. And I can tell you for sure, I feel a lot better when I can propose the full extent of services and capabilities and skill sets and not be hampered by price until the end of the conversation. So in my business experience, being on both sides of the table, selling and procuring, we think that price creates trade-offs right from the very beginning. You went into a car dealership and you said to the guy trying to sell you the car, I'm not willing to spend any more than $36,500 right from the beginning of the conversation. You're going to be shown only those cars where he thinks he can get that price delivered. And it may not have all the bells and whistles or the actual model that you want. If you focus on price, there's a potential sacrifice of quality. If you focus on price, there's a potential sacrifice of capability and also the service portfolio that's being offered. Remember that if the prices up front becomes the critical factor, then the vendor or the supplier is going to find ways to be able to make their margin within that pricing parameter. And that usually means trade-offs in various levels of service, capability, or quality. So I want to make sure that it's clear is that we fully understand in this process the importance of price. And we understand that price is a critical factor in the ultimate selection of any vendor or supplier. What we're talking about is to move that conversation about the price, not at the front end, but at the back end of the conversation with the vendor or supplier, the timing of it, and how we get to that right price. We're going to talk about mining and gaining information of what the parameters of price should be under current market conditions. And then also to discuss how we go about negotiating to get to that right price. The methodology that we put forth here believes that in purchasing, supply chain, and overall management, what we not want is the cheapest. What we really want to try to achieve is the best value for our spend. That's a critical component here, because if the mindset and the culture in the organization is that we're going to always get the cheapest price, then that may not apply to this type of opportunity. Because what we really think we should be striving for, and all companies should be striving for, is really to get the best value for your spend. It impacts quality, it impacts the scope of services, and ultimately impacts the performance of the vendor or supplier. So a couple of other things that we kind of have as a mindset as we enter this type of negotiation, that everything is on the table for negotiation. That price is critical, but it cannot drive the RFP process. That there are other opportunities exist in the RFP process for corporate process betterments, and I'll share some examples of that in a moment. Appreciate that RFPs typically cross fiefdoms and silos in an organization, and therefore connectivity must be managed as part of the procurement responsibility. And also understanding that personnel behavior styles can be a critical element in successful negotiations and RFPs. In negotiation classes that we teach and train with, we spend a fair amount of time talking about people's behavior, their negotiation style, and how they approach business in general, because the more that we understand that, the better that we are more informed and therefore can negotiate more successfully. So an opportunity to negotiate everything, any aspect of the relationship is up for discussion. Any no need or requirement, and price is always ultimately a negotiating point, but at the end of the conversation. So we negotiate for everything, what we need, what we want, and what we can get. And once we have those accomplished, we then negotiate price. If we benchmark the range of pricing in the market, then we know what to shoot for. And that means that benchmarking and mining is a critical component of what we do in procurement. And that should be an ongoing thing in the day-to-day activity, that we have an awareness of what our spend is and what it should be relative to like and similar companies being benchmarked in mind. So what drives the negotiation first are the deliverables, then followed by the price. You need to think like the vendor and the salesperson that you're dealing with. Other opportunities in the RFP process for corporate betterments. Technology enhancements is always a big thing, because as we all know, technology and the relationship between our vendors and suppliers and the integration that generally takes place is a much more critical factor today than it ever was. The payment terms and the opportunity to get more extended terms or more favorable terms, or when we pay maybe all up front, we get a discount of the amount of money that's due. The service portfolio that's being offered being more robust and more expanded. More efficient processes in the overall relationship of how products or services are delivered into the organization. That possibly there's training involved as part of the consideration of what we're paying for. And buyback programs for products that are now out of state or out of market, where they buy them back. Particularly, for example, if you were buying computers for your organization, or cell phones, or any kind of technology that eventually has an expiration date. So I mentioned that they cross various fiefdoms and silos in your organization. So it's critical for us, because we're a service part of an organization. Our clients are the stakeholders in the organization. the other business managers that we're providing a procurement function or a supply chain function for. So we need to identify those stakeholders. We need to assure senior management engagement. I'm going to talk a little bit about the tier one suppliers is really what we're talking about here, where our greatest amount of spend is. Okay, so we need senior management to be engaged in that process. We need to be assuring comprehensive collaboration between the silos and the various fiefdoms in the organization. At the end of the day, what we're trying to do is to influence better decision-making on the part of a team that's involved in making the decision and obviously impacted by that decision. What we ultimately need to do.
Tom, did you want any, I have a couple questions here for you.
Sure. We can break it up. Absolutely.
Okay, great. Let me go.
I don't see them, so if you could read to me, that would be great. One or two of
Yeah,
them.
no problem. Okay, from the buyer viewpoint, do you have an example of the decision criteria for comparing the supplier's offerings with this approach?
Yeah, when we get to another slide, I'm going to show you a Excel spreadsheet very quickly that we use, but that's something in the when I go through the 12 steps, I'm going to make mention of this, that you have to prepare the criteria that you're going to use in the selection process. So it could be the timing of the project they're working on, or the timing of the delivery of a product, the quality control standards that your technical people have supported. And what you're going to do is list these out on an Excel spreadsheet as to what all the criteria are. And in the RFP, you're going to identify that to the potential vendors and suppliers competing in the RFP to say that here's the criteria that we're going to rank you on. What I do is use an Excel spreadsheet because at the end of the day, all the people involved in the RFP process on my side that's helping me make that decision, I have them grade each of those areas that we've chosen on a 1 to 5 basis, 1 being we're not that happy and 5 we're very happy, so that we can compare our notes. And this uses quantitative or metrics in the decision-making process. So what I'm saying is you're just going to create a listing of the criteria that's established by the stakeholders and internally as to how you're going to require this product or service delivery into your company.
Okay, we have one more question. How do you get benchmark pricing?
I'm going to come again on a slide in a little while on that, but really at the end of the day, I'm going to give you what I think are your best sources for benchmarking. One of them obviously is friendly competitors and organizations like ISM New Jersey, where you can have other fellow members who might be in like or similar supply chain responsibilities or procurement responsibilities. Your open dialogue with them, pick up the phone, develop a relationship, and ask them, what are they paying for a particular product or a service? But that's one thing. The other thing, which I'm a big proponent of, and I try to get all my clients in procurement and supply chain to do, is to attend industry trade shows. We obviously know the last 2 years that's been a difficult thing to do, but eventually they'll come back again. When those industry trade shows, because you have a concentrated number of vendors and suppliers trying to sell their products and services, and you could see in 2 or 3 days, 40, 50, 60 different companies. And then in those conversations, you can start to ask questions like, what's the range of pricing do you think that you would be charging? And you start to accumulate that information. And that's really one of the best ways of benchmarking and mining that kind of information.
Okay, I'll hold off any other questions until you get to the other slides because you may be.
Okay, no problem.
Points. Okay.
So when we're doing an RFP, one of the things that we have to decide is why are we doing the RFP? Because RFP takes a lot of time, a lot of energy that's committed to it, resources, and sometimes money is even being expended to do it. And you have to decide whether you're just testing the market to see what's out there, okay? Or are you trying to hold the incumbent to a harder position, meaning that you really don't want to change the incumbent. You think they're doing a good job, but you really want to bring them to a higher standard, either in their service portfolio or in their price. Or you may be looking, because you're very unhappy with the current service provider, okay, or you're unhappy with the current vendor or supplier, that you really want to replace them. And the reason I say this is that this will define how you approach the RFP once you decide what's the relevance of it to your organization and what you're trying to accomplish. Understanding behavior styles can be critical elements to the successful negotiation of the RFP. The better you learn how and why people behave is a critical aspect. Since I've been doing this now for well over 30 years, every year I spend a lot of time in reading materials on people's behavior, negotiation psychology, the psychology of people in business and subjects like that. I attend a lot of webinars and seminars on the subject because in negotiation, you're always in an advantage position if you can understand what is motivating or what's the other person's agenda and what they're trying to achieve. And it gives you the best option to really influence behavior, because at the end of the day, that's what negotiation is. You're influencing behavior to go in a particular direction. And ultimately that will lead and support better decisions. So this better value for our spend is the idea of trying to get better quality, greater performance, and more desired results for the amount of money that we're spending. And that comes back to the point I made earlier, that we're not looking necessarily for the cheapest, right? What we're looking for is when we spend that dollar, how much are we getting for it? And really what we want to do is get the greatest value for that dollar. So our methodology that we've been talking about here incorporates both quantitative and qualitative, and we'll talk about that in a moment. It requires a high level of mining and benchmarking. It creates a more robust and productive vendor relationship. And at the end of the day, affords the best opportunity for business process enhancements. It obtains your organization a competitive pricing structure. And I use the term competitive, not the cheapest, okay? And it works with and ties into the tiering of suppliers, and I'll address that in a moment. So I mentioned incorporates quantitative and qualitative. Quantitative, we define as using metrics, science, data, proven algorithms in order to make our decisions, as compared to qualitative, which is using our sensibilities and our experience and our emotions and how we go about and navigate the decision-making process. Quantitative will always trump qualitative, but what we really want to try to achieve is that our sensibilities tend to agree with the metrics that are being addressed in the decision-making process. In the high level of mining and benchmarking in RFP, who's going to be involved in the RFP, to what extent they're going to be involved, and to what degree or extent or how much they're going to be involved are all very relevant factors. So at the vendor, what we're trying to do is to get a relationship with the vendor in this process where they're able to put their best foot forward unencumbered by price. It then promotes a more collaborative joint effort and creates one effort that really will allow for sustainability. Because at the end of the day, in procurement, we do want to make sure that our vendors are making a sufficient margin and profitability for the work that's being performed. Because if they end up doing something at cost or losing money, at the end of the day, that's going to impact the quality of the services portfolio that they're offering, because they're going to need to make money and they're going to have to cut somewhere. So I work very hard in the purchasing process to open the door this way so that I can make sure that the vendor is also going to be satisfied in what they're earning for it. But again, I don't bring that into the conversation until the very end. The process affords the best opportunity for business process enhancements. We have learned through trial and error. We create a clean slate for the vendor or supplier. And you'd be actually amazed at what they can do, offer, and provide when they're given that clean slate. So benchmarking and mining leads to robust and valued information. Good information makes for better and more informed decisions. And it defines what our pricing range should look like in order to be competitive. Not again, the cheapest, but competitive. So this also ties into the concept of tiering with suppliers. All of us, most of us are working long hours, working very hard at our responsibilities, whether it was pre-COVID or during COVID. So it's important that we focus in the area where 80% of our spend is with 20% our vendors, which is typical in most companies. Every time we do analysis where a company asks us to help them tier their suppliers, we just get a payables run from accounting. And it's very easy when it's run in order of the most spend to the least spend to define that 80% is very typical of our money is spent with 20% of our vendors. But we also add into that tier one supplier group smaller spends, but they might have a critical product or service that comes into our supply chain. And that's where our focus and efforts and energies in this process that we're talking about lies. Because you're not going to do this process for the smaller spends that we have in the company, because we generally don't have that kind of time or the energy level to do that. So we're really focusing on the top tier one suppliers and vendors in our portfolio. So as we matured this opportunity, we created over the years 12 steps. Originally, it was as much as 21 steps. And over the years, we've kind of consolidated and brought it down to an easier 12 steps. And we'll look at these 12 steps. Mining and benchmarking, organizing potential vendors, creating the deliverables and expectations, the initial outreach, the initial vending, creating a cooperative process, establishing metrics, bringing the options from a larger amount down to a smaller amount, allowing dog and pony demonstrations, making the decision, implementation, and follow-up are all the critical steps. So I'll just take a break for a moment. And Kathy, if you want to throw a couple of questions, because I see a bunch have come in. So if you want to throw a couple at me, that's fine.
Okay, let me see what we have here. We did have a comment from Deborah. I usually get a price-based off a template I share to be able to compare the rates of the market, but don't rely on the pricing at the RFP stage to be sure to be able to compare appropriately and learn more about the market conditions. Then I negotiate the right scope with the right provider and get the right price.
That's a good process. And if you're having success with it, I think that works very well. Remember, I'm sharing with you one concept and one tool. It's not an end all, and it's not necessarily the only way to look at it. And I like how you're doing it because it's an organized approach. And you do have numbers to take an idea of what you think you may be spending. So I think it's a good process.
Okay, we have another question in. How do you address variances in scoring from evaluators when you have some scoring a 1 or 2, and for the same subject, others scoring 4 and 5 on the happy scale?
Right. It's a great question, and that happens a lot and so forth. We go back to the drawing board. We get everybody in the room or today in a virtual conference call, and we sit back and we say, listen, we have gaps here that are huge as to how we feel about it. So let's talk it out. And what generally happens when you do that, you start to bridge and create compromises in how you feel about the company, and the numbers get closer towards the middle rather than being on the extremes. So it becomes a collaborative discussion that you have with the people where there's this gap in it. And a lot of times they've brought emotion or the qualitative side into the analysis rather than the quantitative side. And when you discuss it out, you can generally bring them to a more neutral or compromised position closer to where it should be rather than these extremes, one or the other. And we all know that in our organizations, we all have a certain amount of difficult people. And sometimes you'll never get the difficult people to line up the way that you want to. So that I take as an aberration, and we try to eliminate the aberrations and move them to the side. So we don't take them seriously when we're in that kind of circumstance.
That's all we have for now.
Okay, great. So mining and benchmarking works in this model if we're doing it all the time, okay, and developing resources, services, capabilities, potential vendors, and market pricing. That it's not just done at the time we're doing an RFP, but it's something that we're collectively looking at. So we come back to the concept of tiering the suppliers, meaning that in that concentrated spend of where 80% of our spend is in 20%, 80% of our spend is in 20% of vendors, It's in those areas that we should be spending our time in getting information that allows us to mine and benchmark. So the question came in before. So industry trade shows is really one of the best options that exist, again, because you have this concentrated amount of vendors and suppliers in one location. And a trade show generally runs for 2 or 3 days. In 2 or 3 days, if you spend your time wisely, you could see easily, 10, 20 companies a day going from booth to booth or various meeting halls to see them. And even in the virtual events that are happening now, they all have these rooms that you can go to have side conversations with vendors and suppliers who are at the show virtually. Allowing salespeople in. I always take an issue, and again, because I sit on both sides of both procurement and also on sales, is that a lot of procurement people, supply chain people will hide behind their emails or their voicemail and not see the number of salespeople who want to come in and see them. And I think that in a number percentage, I said you should be spending about 7 or 8% of your time seeing potential vendors and suppliers. And one of the reasons I say that, because it's a great opportunity to have a conversation where it may not be your intent to replace a vendor or supplier that you have, but when you have competing ones come in, they like to talk and they talk about the things that they're doing, and you're gaining information. And you can ask questions like, what's your range of pricing for this particular service or this particular product? Where are you coming in at now? They may not give you a specific price, but they may give you an idea. And that's part of that mining and benchmarking process. We have search engines that are all kind of available to help us, one, Google being one of them that a lot of us use and so forth, not as an end all, but as a starting point for mining and benchmarking. And then there are lots of consulting companies. All your big accounting firms have all kinds of supply chain capabilities. And then there are independent companies like mine that are all available to help you, support you in areas that you may not be comfortable with or unfamiliar with in trying to mine or benchmark what's out and available out there. So in organizing potential vendors, some companies make this a more sophisticated approach, and they take 3 steps in the RFP process. They have a request for interest, which is sending out some basic information to a number of companies to see whether they'd be interested in participating in an RFP. A request for a quote is really just getting their interest in providing maybe a range of numbers of where they would come into, where the RFP becomes the more formal process of clearly identifying the specific deliverables and timeframes and expectations, and then getting ultimately at the end of that RFP, a formal proposal and quote from them. Creating expectations and deliverables. This is what gets moved to an Excel spreadsheet so that you can take the items that's important to you and then ultimately use it in a quantitative analysis of ranking one vendor to another. It requires collaboration, identification of stakeholders, and those impacted by the RFP decision. Keeping them to the point and simple, concise, if very technical, which happens in some RFPs, utilize technicians with addendums. Don't put it in the body of the RFP, have them as addendums towards the end. And you're clearly defining what you have as expectations and deliverables. You want to make it short and concise as possible and easy to understand for anybody involved. In the initial outreach, it becomes part of that daily mining and benchmarking, because when people come in to see you or talk to you, you can sit back and say, well, our intent is to do a RFP starting in March of 2022 that will end by the end of May 2022. You have to identify who the RFP participants is going to be. I'm always asked, how many should you bring into? And that really depends on the resources that you have, because managing an RFP takes a lot of time. But I would generally say that if you start off with about 8 to 10 companies at the front end, I wouldn't go any more than that. What I try to eventually do, and we'll look at a visual in a moment, is to try to bring the initial group down to around 2 or 3. And I focus on those 2 or 3 in a much more serious way. You create an RFP outline, which outlines what your expectations are, the deliverables are required, the data that they need to help make a RFP possible, the timeline, and whatever controls you're going to put in place relative to how they give the information back to you. Timing, I'm asked a lot about the timing of RFPs, and we try to allow 3 to 4 months as a preferable time frame, meaning from the start of when the information goes out. So if I started the first week of January, the anticipation might be that by the end of March, we're going to be prepared to make a decision and maybe incorporate that action to be in April or May coming into the second quarter of the year. But I've done RFPs all in the same day. And I've done ones that were a week long because of an urgency that's involved. But when we know in advance and we have a schedule of knowing who our tier 1 suppliers are going to be, and we have a strategic planning for 2022 in October, November, December of 2021, that's when we start to plan out the RFPs that we're going to have for the year. So the visual here is like a funnel. And the 3-month period is taking a higher level group of people at the high end, as many as, let's say, 8 to 10. And we try to quickly in the process, moving that narrowing down to where we're going to get down to maybe 2 or 3 companies towards the end of that funnel. And the 12 steps I'm going to walk you through in a moment, okay, takes us down that funnel. And until we get to like around the 8th or 9th step, that's the only time we start to bring pricing into the negotiation. Almost from step 1 to 7, we're only concerned on the scope of services or the quality of the product or the performance of the product up to that point in time. Create a collaborative process in our organization. Again, having the mindset that we're a service part of our organization. We're servicing the managers and the key personnel in our company and helping them procure goods and services into the organization. So we want to allow fellow participation, which will most likely obtain favorable results from those stakeholders and those people impacted by the decision. It also demonstrates your willingness in procurement and as a procurement or supply chain person to accept other viewpoints and considerations. You're talking about stakeholders, impacted individuals, in many cases, senior management, if it's a large enough purchase or a much critical service or product coming into your business. Also allows you to maybe share the responsibilities and the workload with other people. And also allows for the obtaining of technical support that may be a key ingredient because you might have a product or service that has a high degree of technical aspect to it, maybe above and beyond your capability of understanding the supply chain and procurement. Establishing metrics. This creates the quantitative versus the qualitative. The metrics will always trump an opinion. And senior management, if you think about this, your CEO, your president, your divisional vice president, the CFO, they want to see decisions based upon actual hard data, metrics, science, algorithms that support the decision. And metrics help justify the decision-making process, particularly when it aligns with your qualitative or the sensibilities or your own experience aligns with what supports the metrics. So again, we look at this funnel, and what we're trying to do is to take the options and move them down the funnel, okay? And as it moves down the funnel, it becomes more manageable. You're also refining the deliverables because information you've received in the process of managing the RFP might cause a change in how you want to present something because you may have learned something that was now available that you weren't sure was available. And it's when you get down to those lower steps in the process is when you bring in price into the equation. Allow dog and pony demos. Allow the vendor to fully demonstrate their capabilities. Prior to COVID, obviously, they wanted to always bring in a team of 2, 3, 4 people. And in your conference room, they would do a dog and pony show, generally lasting about an hour. That can all be done virtually now. And in some cases, even more robustly, because you can bring more people into the loop from their side and your side much more easily in a virtual format. The RFP allows internal stakeholders to meet the potential vendor. Remember, they're the ones typically are going to have to deal with the vendor when they deliver a product or a service. It allows for a direct face-to-face dialogue, which can assist in gauging the viability of any vendor or supplier that's participating in the RFP. So this is a sample of the Excel spreadsheet. And one of the things that we also bring into the equation is salience. And this answers part of the question that was asked earlier, which is salience allows an individual to add in a factor relative to how important an issue of that line item is to them, because the price of something might be very important, let's say to the CFO, but the quality might be more important to somebody in manufacturing or in operations. So it allows them to add a number which is relative to the importance of that line item of subject, that line item of deliverable is to them. So salience is another thing that can be brought into the quantitative process. Again, what we try to do is align the quantitative with the qualitative, the metrics, sensibilities, and experience. If they get aligned, it's a better decision. Now you might ask, well, what happens when they're not aligned and that the metrics support something that your sensibilities and experience are telling you it shouldn't be? I go back to the drawing board. I redo the metrics to make sure that I did them correctly. And I review all my sensibilities and experience. And generally what happens when you go back to the drawing board is you end up getting a closer alignment of the two. And sometimes you have to make compromises when you're still thing far apart. So I hold to the factor that the RFP is not done till it is working, which means that once you've made a decision on a new vendor or supplier, and now they're going to come into the organization, that's also part of your responsibility to make sure that they're entering the organization and that product or the service that they're going to provide is actually working the way it was intended. So we create an action plan, okay? The steps of who's going to do what, okay? What time frame and how it's going to be handled. Recognize that action plans will get tweaked as it moves forward. And you need to get 100% commitment from the vendor to be guided by that intentional action plan that gets developed, which allows for the smooth transition of the vendor and supplier into the organization. And if it's an existing vendor or supplier and you've just made changes, it's then just handling what those changes that were made with that particular vendor or supplier. Follow-up. Follow-up is a critical step because you want to make sure it's working. And the wrong mindset is to assume that because no one is complaining that everything is okay. And we all know that that's not the case in general circumstances. So we follow up to make sure that everything is running the way that it was intended. The RFP methodology, when practiced correctly, generally gets you more than you would have. And it gets you that competitive price. It also gets you the best opportunity for a sustainable relationship with that vendor or supplier. And in vendor management, at the end of the day, we want longer term sustainable relationships because we don't want to have to go through that RFP process all the time because the amount of energy that's consumed and the whole process takes a lot of time and effort. The RFP process that I put forth here recognizes the concept of being open, honest, transparent, and straightforward as a business approach to all procurement and supply chain responsibilities and the RFPs. At the end of the day, it offers a great working RFP model to obtain the best value for your spend. And is that not, at the end of the day, what we really are all chasing? Additional last thought, if you are planning to utilize a contract or the agreement or the PO model, then put that into the RFP up front so the vendor can see what expectations is in the agreement. So if you have a particular vendor agreement or a master services agreement, or you have a guideline when buying a new product, okay, of what they have to follow, put that up front so that they can see what your expectation is that's going to be in a written agreement. And it helps with the legal side of the relation. So I appreciate everybody's kind attention, and I see that there are lots of questions. So why don't you go with it, and I'll try to answer as many as I can.
Okay, sharing confidential information like price raises ethical concerns. Need to be careful not to destroy trust. What do you share without oversharing when benchmarking with peers?
Well, if you're talking about peers in your organization, there shouldn't be anything that shouldn't be able to be disclosed for the most part. If you're talking about sharing pricing relative to a vendor or a supplier that's asking for what the current pricing is so that they could try to make their proposal more competitive, I think every company has to look introspectively in this regard and see how they feel morally and ethically they feel about it. In my organization, I have no problem in sharing the price to a potential vendor or supplier in an RFP, because I think that's important information that helps them benchmark where we are and helps them to be more competitive. I also, if I have a favored vendor or a favored supplier, when I do an RFP, I show them favor by giving them the last opportunity to requote at the end. So I create a balancing act in terms of giving that information out, but I also give that favored vendor or supplier a last opportunity to requote if it doesn't look like they're going to retain the business. So I kind of handle that moral and ethical dilemma that way. But I would strongly suggest in your companies that this is something that's talked out proactively, and you come to a policy decision. And the policy decision might not necessarily to be straight out in every case. It might be to look at each circumstance and then make a decision based in each circumstance.
Okay, next question. Is it appropriate to ask directly about vendors' margin? Do you feel it is something they should share? How do we go around that question when the vendor is not willing to share that information?
I don't ask the vendor ever what their margin is. I ask it by, are you satisfied with the margin that you get in this relationship? But the price that you're charging, is the margin a favorable margin for you? So I never ask them specifically what it is. So, because they're most likely not going to disclose it, but I do get an affirmation that they are, because there are times when they'll say, well, it's really tight, or no, we're kind of doing this as an entry point. We're not really making money at this. Well, then I go back to the negotiation table, because if I really want that vendor or supplier, I want them to be at a successful margin for themselves. So I'll start to renegotiate the pricing. And it may be that I say to them, not at this point in time, but how about we look at it in 6 months and see where we're both at, allowing you to maybe adjust your pricing to accommodate a more profitable circumstance. So it becomes a collaborative, cooperative, and as I mentioned before, transparent, open, honest, straightforward dialogue that you have with the vendor or supplier. And again, you can't have that with all your suppliers. It's impossible generally. So I focus on that top tier supplier group.
Okay, next question. Do you use an RFP boilerplate to start the RFP structure?
Yes. Yes. We try to create for our clients a boilerplate, which has, I would say, 80% of the basic information that an RFP should have. And then the last 20% is customized specific to the product or service that we're looking to, put into the RFP.
Okay, next one. It's a follow-up question to a previous one you had answered. When the evaluation committee is brought in to discuss a wide variance in scores, are the members allowed to revise their scores? Or since you mentioned compromise, is an average no longer taken for that topic and is scored more as a collaborative score, one that everyone can agree on, perhaps a 3 for the 1 to 2 scores and a 4 to 5 scores?
The first part of the question is yes, people are allowed to change. And what happens is when you call everybody into the meeting today, most likely virtually, and you're going to sit back and say, listen, we're at an impasse here because we have a very divergent scoring here. So we'd like to create a discussion as to how we came about making these choices and to see if we can come closer together as a group. Let's just assume that there's 6 or 7 people in that group. So whoever's the leader is going to take each line item and talk it out and try to see that, well, now with this conversation taking place, maybe somebody misinterpreted something, or they didn't hear something correctly, or they're working under a misnomer, and you're going to correct that, and you will allow people to go back and score again. Okay, it may not be at that meeting, but you can sit back and say, can you get back to me by tomorrow, 4 o'clock, with a new revised scoring sheet. And I have found over the years that when you do that, you'll move it closer. And I've had situations where we've gone to a third meeting where we discuss those points again to bring it closer. And eventually you'll get to where you need to be, which is a consensus, okay? And the consensus usually creates some degree of compromise between the people making that decision and judgment.
Okay, how do you come up with evaluation criteria for demos? And do you integrate the first part of the scoring with that, or treat exclusively it as a second step?
Exclusively as a second step. Because the amount of time that's involved, you're not going to, if you have 10 companies in the bidding process, the beginning, to do that across the board with 10 companies is just generally too much time consuming involved. If for some reason you had the resources and the time to do that, that would be very valuable. But generally, most people and companies don't have the time. So you kind of esoterically on the front end are making decisions based upon the performance that they give in the first stages of the RFP, and you eliminate those companies that you think are not going to be able to provide the scope of performance or quality or services that you require. It's only when you get down to the last group are you going to really do a quantitative analysis using metrics.
Okay, do any of you use an RFP tool for analysis and evaluation? If so, who do you use?
In vendor management, we'll bring, let's say, for example, we made a decision in January of 2021 to move the purchasing of certain supplies into the company to a new vendor. And let's just make the assumption that we have a 2-year contract with that vendor. We would, on the anniversary, which would be now in January of 2022, we would sit back and say, okay, with that same committee that made the decision, we would create those same criteria and say, how would you rank this company now at this point in time after we've experienced them for a year? And based upon that criteria, you would have a vendor meeting with that vendor, okay? And in that vendor meeting, you would discuss where maybe they dropped down in how you felt about them in a particular area that you're going to discuss out so that you can create action steps for them to correct the problem, okay? These are called stewardship reports, and you try to force these quarterly business reviews or stewardship reports with your important vendors, and you can use the metrics to hold them accountable, and you can use those metrics to help influence different behavior or changes in how they deliver a product or a service.
Is it best to have an even mix of qualitative and quantitative evaluations, or does it matter the percentage variance?
I've never been asked that question. I have to think about that for a moment. I'm not sure that I would frame the question the way that you asked it. Is that what we really try to achieve is that both are being used simultaneously. Because we're emotional animals, we're going to bring always emotion into the conversation. We're thinkers, so we're going to bring our thoughts into the decision making, and we have experiences, right? Some of us have been doing this for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, 30 years, and so forth. So we're going to bring our experiences into this. What we're really trying to achieve is that our sensibilities and our experiences align with the metrics that are being created. And the big issue comes in not when they're aligned, but when they're not aligned. Okay. And that's when we have to go back to the drawing board. So I'm reframing the question a little bit.
In the RFP, can you share more understanding on the circumstances under which the tiering would be beneficial?
The tiering becomes critical in my perspective because none of us have the time to do an RFP in all our procurement responsibilities. So the tiering allows us to define who are the critical vendors and suppliers to the organization. Those that we have the greatest amount of spend with, along with those that provide a critical product or service, and the spend might not be so great. That's our tier one suppliers. And what I'm suggesting is that should be the focus of our activity in supply chain and procurement, is where that critical factors apply, amount of spend or critical nature of the product or service. And therefore, that's where RFPs can be used as a tool to find new vendors or suppliers or manage existing vendors or suppliers.
Okay, what are recommended approaches to weigh other critical requirements such as tier 1, tier 2, supplier diversity, ESG, etc., and the RFP and sourcing selection process?
Right. So if you take supplier diversity, that could be a line item in the vetting process, meaning that are they a minority-owned company? Are they a woman-owned company? Is it a veteran-owned company? Whatever you have as your criteria. And if they were on a 1 to 5 scale, they're going to get a 5 on that. If they're not, they're going to get a 1 on that schedule. So you would bring the criteria of diversity into the metrics that you're using in evaluating the company. Now, I've been involved with many companies that specifically will say to procurement that we want this purchase to be a diversity purchase. Okay. So that means that the companies that you're going to invite in all provide that opportunity of being a diverse provider, meaning that, again, they're minority owned or they're woman owned or they're veteran owned and things like that. So you identify those companies that are out there. And ISM in New Jersey, along with other ISMs, do a pretty good job of having these diversity events and so forth, so that as in purchasing, you can start to identify a lot of companies that are set up that way to be able to make those kind of choices and bring them into your RFP portfolio.
Okay, another question. In recent years, increasing number of suppliers have become reluctant to participate in RFQs due to quote mill activity, where organizations issue RFQs as a means for price mining. What trends are occurring in procurement organizations that are cause for concern within supplier communities?
Well, the first thing we have to remember, we're all dealing with this COVID issue, and a lot of suppliers and vendors aren't even providing quotes or providing responses to RFPs because they don't have the manpower or the resources, or they're so filled up with their existing responsibilities that they may not even want to take on new clients and so forth. So we're at a challenging time in procurement and supply chain just because of the COVID issue. And for those of you who are involved in planning, it's likely that this is going to continue for the balance of this year and probably into the first quarter of 2023. So we have to rethink all of that. But I would say, generally, I'm not. I think that I don't like on the selling side to respond to RFIs or RFQs either. I try to put forth who we are as a company and then try to get right to the RFP process quickly. So I can understand why a lot of companies are reticent or reluctant to do that and so forth. And I would say, as generally, I mentioned RFI and RFQ only because it comes up as a question, but I generally am not a proponent of it. And I don't think that you want to go down that path. Identify the companies that you'd want to have bid proposal and go right to the RFP. It would be my suggestion.
Thank you. I just want to let everybody know, yes, you will be getting a copy of the slides. I've got a couple of those comments as well. But one last final question. As regards to RFP tool, we are talking about RFP tool, which publishes the RFP to the vendors for response, evaluation, and analysis rather than procurement having to manually do this analysis in Excel. Which companies would you or the listing participants recommend we use or use?
I'm not sure I understand the question, Kathy.
Okay, they wanted to know which companies people use for in regards to the RFP tool. I could read it again if you'd like.
Well, the only tool that I use, I don't buy any external services, and the clients that I work with, we use Excel exclusively. Excel, we find that Excel is an undervalued and an underutilized tool in helping us create the metrics in helping manage our supply chain responsibilities, particularly in the RFP process. And so we're a big user. I spend a lot of time. I have a number of analysts on the staff that are real experts in the use of Excel, and they have our whole team involved with it. And we put it to our clients all the time, and a lot of them who buy external technologies do away with the external technology and just go right to Excel. They had no idea how robustly it could be used in the management of data. So I can only speak to that being really the place to go is Excel. And Excel has lots of classes under Microsoft. They happen all over the country. They're obviously being done virtually now, but I think that's a well-spent effort or initiative, is to take a class in Excel, and it shows you how to use that relative to your job responsibilities, particularly in organizing and managing data and analysis.
They did mention Scout RFP. Do you?
I've heard of it, and I've seen it in a couple of shows that I've been to. They've been demonstrating and so forth, but I can't speak to how well it works or whatever. Maybe somebody who's in the audience here might be able to speak to it.
Yeah, they were saying that they are Excel-based tools.
Oh, okay, right.
Yep. Okay, we've got a couple of people that actually use it, so that's a recommendation. So right there. We had many questions. Thanks everybody for all the questions. This was great. One more question. This will be our final question. Are e-auctions dead these days?
Yeah, I would say yes. I mean, in reality, they're not. There's still e-auctions going on, but as being a successful tool, I don't find them at this point in time to be successful. This was even prior to COVID occurring, but I think more so COVID kind of buried it. So I'm not a big proponent of it. I do have one client that does use it pretty successfully. They're actually in the commodity trading business, so it kind of fits that mold that they're in. But most other companies, I don't think have found it successful. And appreciate the fact that we all have to be conscious of the fact that our jobs in procurement and supply chain has changed dramatically since March of 2020. And it's not the same what we're doing. It's a much more difficult job that we have. And I'm hoping that at the end of all this, the supply chain manager and the procurement manager's profile has raised in corporate America as being a much more important function. And therefore you get a seat at the table and hopefully get a higher compensation and all the rewards that come with that and so forth. Ultimately is what I'm hoping will happen, because I've already seen it happen in a lot of companies, that supply chain and procurement was a secondary consideration in the overall senior management of a company. But I think they realize now how critical it is to the success of the business model, and it's been elevated in a company.
Thank you. Okay, I think we actually did all the questions. And did you have any closing comments before we conclude today?
No, I just want to share with everybody again that this was just one concept. It's not an end all, and it doesn't mean that other things can't work if you've been practicing and using them. And you're welcome. My contact information is here. You're welcome to ask any other questions, or you're welcome to call me and get a debate on the conversation or expand on anything I've talked about. We have a very strong relationship with Kathy, and so there's no costs involved. There's no obligations. You're just welcome to reach out. We'd be more than happy to try to answer anything or point you in any directions if you're looking for support or assistance.
Oh, well, thank you, Tom, for bringing this topic to our audience today. It was, as you can see, very well attended today, and lots of feedback and questions and comments. I'd like to also thank everybody that attended today as well. Shortly, you will be getting an email from me. It will include a copy of the slides, continuing education credit for today's attendance. And then as soon as our recording is posted, I'll have the link, and then you can actually review the recording if you'd like to share it with your colleagues or review it again. But at this time, I'd like to close out today's program, and thank you all for joining us. Have a great day, everybody.
Everybody be safe and well.
Thank you.